Hello, and welcome to the Academic Center for Writing presentation on modern syntax and linguistics. This presentation was written and narrated by Jason Schneider, writing specialist in the ACW. Let's begin with the components of modern syntax. It is quite simple, hence it is called minimalist syntax, because it is constructed by joining two things. These two things are called a head and a complement. One head selects for a phrase. We can see that head X of the phrase XP selects the phrase ZP. We'll see this being recursive, repeating several times because theoretically, heads selecting phrases can repeat infinitively, which we cannot demonstrate here since there just isn't enough time for that. Each phrase has its own head too, and that head will select another phrase. We can see this by looking at the head Z of the phrase ZP selecting the phrase WP. We'll explain this a bit more in detail later. In modern syntax, tense is seen as a separate node from verbs. Let's unpack these examples to show that the three sentences share one thing in common and have a tense phrase separate from the verb phrase. Typically, prescriptive English teachers and textbooks say that English only has two tenses, the past and present. This might have stemmed from the idea that the present and past tense is inflected on the verb and cannot stand on its own, as its own word, in contrast to the future tense denoted by the modal verb will. To show that this prescriptive assumption is not true, let's look at the contraction of the subject Jim and will. Now, these two are completely two different words, and the way the theory goes, there can be an underlying phrase as long as it is phonetically present with one word. This can be troublesome how I just described this, but debating the phonetics and phonology will not be the issue in this video. Now that we have established that, we can further assert the same with the inflections of the present and past on verbs. However, we still need more to be convinced, right? When the present tense is inflected on the verb, we see it as one word, or one syntactic node. However, we rephrase this into a question. Tense must occur before the subject, not the verb. If both tense and the verb were one and the same, then the verb should occur before the subject. But that would make the sentence ungrammatical. We know that a head selects as complement because all verbs do not select complements alike. For example, there are certain restrictions that stipulate that the verb devour must select for a noun phrase, whereas eat is not as restricted and has the option to select a complement. The verb believe cannot be inflected if it is a complement of the tense phrase, whereas we find the verb expects is inflected with tense because we had said earlier that more than one underlying phrases can be phonetically represented by one word. Tense cannot trigger any restrictions on expects because of locality. This means that the verb expects is in another phrase where tense is where the modal verb may cannot stipulate any restrictions. And essentially, may can only put any kind of restrictions on like the verb believe, but not expects. And that's because believe is within the phrase that may is in. May is the head of the tense phrase. Believe is the complement, the verb phrase. Another interesting thing is that we can see that the verb and tense are not one and the same because tense inflected on the verb such as to watched is ungrammatical. The verb wonder selects whether, in which whether selects tense, but the verb once selects to, in which selects a verb, not tense. So the whole point of this is that we're seeing now that there's a chain of, or a sequence of selection here. And so we got one head that's at a higher place in the hierarchy of all these phrases that selects the next head that's within a phrase below, that's in the complement. And then that head will actually select another head that's in it, that's another phrase that's complement to that. Essentially, heads are restricted to sisterhood. So Y, the head Y, is a sister to the phrase XP. And same with the head X is sister to the phrase ZP. So when we say that heads are restricted to sisterhood, we're basically saying that these heads are restricted to this locality. A head of a phrase selects another head of another phrase, and so on. Hence, we have recursion. Even within the phrase, we see that the simple principle of sisterhood applies. MP1 and MP2 have an asymmetric relationship concerning linear ordering, which is why we cannot say himself and subject position. Taking a pause briefly, it needs to be mentioned that complements do not always have to come after heads in other languages. Moreover, we've been talking about tense as a head that selects verbs as a complement. But in many languages, other than English, tense as a head, or any other category as a head, can select for an adjective phrase, noun phrase, and prepositional phrase, respectively. We've discussed heads and selection, and displacement, or also called movement, is where the basics of the theory of universal grammar parts ways. From what has been said so far, we can find the phrase with which friends moves or copies from one place after the verb part. And we know that the phrase with which friends is a complement of the verb part, because part is the verb head that selects the preposition with. However, as we added additional recursive phrases, does John believe that Sue thinks that? This is where questions about whether displacement occurs in one fell swoop or through sequences jumping from one phrase to another until it reaches the beginning of the sentence, or the top of the hierarchy of the left periphery. Some linguists have chosen the stance for one fell swoop. The problem here is how can the phrase with which friend move in one fell swoop? Would this violate locality? It is debatable. Nonetheless, this kind of movement asserts one input and one output. Other linguists have chosen the stance for several successive movements. In this case, this kind of movement asserts a sequence of inputs and outputs. Again, there is another equally important issue here. How can the phrase with which friend make these successive moves? Is it that the phrase doesn't agree in features, so the phrase moves again? If so, when does the derivation or the sequences of moves crash? The point of this is that all theories, no matter how much they differ, are based on the fundamental minimalist theory that phrases are comprised of heads selecting heads of other phrases. Thus, there is a selector and a selectee, and this is the recursive nature of syntax theoretically among all languages. Thanks for watching. For questions about this or any other writing topics, come and visit the Academic Center for Writing in room W114. Thanks again.